The Pantsir-S1's radar dome is still rotating when the first Ukrainian FPV slips between two birch trunks at 60 meters per second. Inside the cabin, a Russian operator stares at a screen that should already be screaming. It isn't. The radar lobe is angled high, designed to hunt cruise missiles and storm shadows, and the quadcopter is skimming the forest floor at 4 meters. 90 seconds from now, $15 million of Russian short-range air defense will be a smoking crater in Kursk Oblast. The Ukrainian operator who put it there is sitting in a basement roughly 40 kilometers away, breathing through his nose, and he has not blinked in 2 minutes. How a $500 quadcopter found, fixed, and finished one of the most heavily defended platforms in the Russian inventory. We will get to the full kill chain in a moment. First, the asset. The Pantsir-S1 is the system Russian commanders trust to keep low-altitude airspace clean. 12 surface-to-air missiles, 2 30mm autocannons, a phased array tracking radar mounted on a Kamaz 6560 chassis that can do 60 on a paved road and 40 on broken terrain. Unit cost, according to Russian state procurement figures cited by Western defense analysts, sits at roughly $15 million. The platform was designed explicitly to do one thing better than any other Russian system in the field: shoot down small drones. That is the punchline of this video, and we have not even reached the strike yet. The geography. Kursk Oblast, the southwestern bulge of the Russian Federation that hangs over the Sumy region of Ukraine. Since the Ukrainian incursion of August 2024, the area has become a moving front line rather than a stable rear. Russian logistics columns running south toward the Sudzha axis must transit a corridor of forest and farmland that Ukrainian reconnaissance has been mapping foot by foot for 14 months. Air defense matters here because the columns are constant, the cargo is heavy, and Ukrainian deep strike drones now reach this corridor every night. The Russian commander on the ground, a lieutenant colonel attached to the Pantsir battery, based on rank chatter intercepted on Russian logistics nets, made a series of decisions that OSINT analysts on Telegram have since called textbook errors. He parked the launcher in a tree line near a forward supply hub, expecting the canopy to defeat optical reconnaissance. He left the radar in operational standby, expecting the emissions to be lost in the regional noise floor. And he held position for 40 consecutive hours, expecting that mobility was a guarantee he could activate the moment something appeared on his screen. He was wrong on all 3 counts. The Ukrainian element, a 2-man FPV cell operating under the General Staff's Unmanned Systems Directorate. Designations withheld in the publicly released footage, but the workflow is consistent with the cells that have produced the most successful Pantsir engagements over the last 6 months. 1 operator on the strike drone, 1 on the reconnaissance Mavic, a 3rd officer, off-screen, running the route mathematics and the electronic warfare overlay. Total cost of the strike platform, according to figures the brigade itself released alongside the footage, is under $500. The warhead is salvaged from a Russian munition recovered intact from a previous engagement, a detail the operating brigade chose to emphasize, and which Russian mill bloggers predictably did not. The stakes are simple to state and brutal to absorb. If a $500 quadcopter can find and finish a $15 million air defense system, no Russian platform behind the lines is safe. That ratio, 1 to 30,000, is what asymmetry looks like written in cost. It is also the ratio that Russian planners have spent 2 years pretending does not apply to their flagship systems. It does. The footage we are about to walk through proves it. 40 hours before the strike, a Ukrainian Mavic 3 launches from a covered position inside the Sumy region and crosses the border at low altitude on a path Ukrainian reconnaissance had cleared of Russian electronic warfare 2 nights earlier. The Mavic is the eye. It is not armed. Its job is to confirm what a previous OSINT pass had suggested, that a Pantsir battery had moved into the tree line north of a logistics hub serving the Sudzha approaches. The reconnaissance operator runs a slow figure-8 pattern at 400 meters altitude, keeping the drone outside what Ukrainian planners assess to be the Pantsir's optical pickup range. At minute 11, the camera resolves a faint signature beneath the canopy, the angular shoulder of a Kamaz chassis, the unmistakable boxy silhouette of the missile launcher rails, a thermal smudge consistent with an idling auxiliary power unit. The operator marks the contact, holds altitude, and waits. For 13 hours, the Mavic and then a relief Mavic keeps the position under observation. Russian crews come and go from a smaller bivouac about 200 meters east. A diesel resupply arrives at 14:30 local time, and the cans are walked across. A detailed Ukrainian planner's log, because it tells them the Pantsir's auxiliary generator is being kept fueled, which means the radar is being kept warm, which means the crew is committed to the position. Russian doctrine for these systems calls for displacement every 4 to 6 hours under contested air conditions. The crew has not moved in 18. Why a Pantsir battery would sit static for this long in an area where Ukrainian drones operate freely is a question OSINT analysts have been asking for months. The likely answer, pieced together from intercepted radio chatter on Russian logistics nets and from the pattern of recent Pantsir losses, is that the system was specifically deployed to defend a high-value logistics node, and that displacement would have meant leaving the node exposed during transitions. The lieutenant colonel chose coverage over survivability. We will come back to that choice. By hour 24, the Ukrainian cell has built a complete operational picture. The Pantsir's radar emissions, picked up by Ukrainian signals collection assets and cross-referenced with the Mavic's optical track, confirm the system is in operational standby with the search radar in low PRF mode. The tracking radar, the lethal element of the system, is not active. That is the gap. Active engagement requires the tracking radar to spool up, and the spool-up time for a target at low altitude and short range is longer than the time it would take an FPV to cover the last 600 meters. The Ukrainian cell now has to solve 3 problems. 1. How to get a $500 quadcopter from the basement command post to the tree line without losing it to Russian electronic warfare. 2. How to keep the drone below the Pantsir's radar lobe for the entire approach. 3. How to deliver the warhead to the part of the system where a single hit will produce a catastrophic kill, not a recoverable one. The route is built backwards from the target. Ukrainian planners hold a map of Russian EW coverage in this sector, built up over months by flying cheap test drones along candidate corridors and noting where they died. There is a band of relative quiet running along a low ridge about 3 kilometers east of the Pantsir position. The strike drone will follow that band, descending to 4 meters above ground as it crosses the last 1,500 meters. Then turn 90 degrees and approach the launcher from a vector. The Pantsir's optical sights have a tree line blocking. The altitude question is the hard one. A Pantsir-S1's primary tracking radar has a documented minimum engagement altitude of around 15 meters for low RCS targets. Below that, the radar can still detect ground clutter and movement, but discriminating a moving FPV from wind in the canopy becomes genuinely difficult. Ukrainian operators have spent the better part of a year learning the exact altitude profile that defeats this discrimination, and the figure they have converged on, based on footage from previous Pantsir engagements, is 4 meters or lower in heavy tree line. The strike drone will fly the entire terminal phase at 3 to 4 meters above the forest floor. The warhead, salvaged, as the brigade noted, from a Russian munition. Roughly 800 grams of high explosive shaped to defeat light armor, more than enough for a Pantsir launcher rail or radar dome, neither of which is armored against direct impact. The warhead is wired into a contact fuse with a backup piezoelectric trigger. The airframe is a quadcopter the cell builds in batches of 20 in a workshop the brigade has not disclosed. Hour 36. The cell does a final pre-launch check. The reconnaissance Mavic is on station at 800-meter slant range from the target, holding a position with line of sight to the launcher and an unobstructed view of the approach corridor. The strike drone is armed, fueled, and on the launch rail. The operator in the basement has been awake for 9 hours and has been drinking warm tea from a thermos because cold caffeine makes his hands shake on the sticks. Hour 39. The Mavic confirms the Pantsir crew is in the standard mid-afternoon posture. 2 crew members in the cabin. 1 walking the perimeter, the launcher rails in the loaded and stowed position. The radar is still in standby, the auxiliary generator is still running. The lieutenant colonel is inside a command tent 200 meters to the east on a radio call with the regional logistics headquarters. None of these details will matter in 7 minutes. Hour 39, 52 minutes. The strike drone goes airborne, climb to 40 meters. Level, accelerate. Turn onto the ingress heading. There is one detail about the approach that most analysts have missed, and it is worth pausing on before the trees close in. The wind. At the time of launch, a westerly is moving through the corridor at roughly 18 kilometers per hour, gusting higher in the open patches. For a quadcopter flying at 3 meters above a forest floor, an 18-kilometer wind is the difference between a controlled approach and a tumble into the undergrowth. The Ukrainian cell had spent the last 2 hours of pre-launch waiting for the gust pattern to settle. It did not settle. They launched anyway because the alternative, losing the window of standby radar, was worse than the alternative of fighting the wind. The operator now has to make hundreds of micro-corrections per second to keep the airframe stable. He is flying first-person video, which means his entire reality is a 4-inch screen showing a juddering forest at 60 kilometers per hour. His co-pilot on the Mavic is calling distance and bearing every 5 seconds. The third officer, on the EW overlay, is calling the Russian jamming environment as it evolves. Every voice in the room is calm. Every voice is also slightly above its normal register. At minute 2 of the flight, the strike drone enters the band of quiet along the low ridge and descends to 4 meters. The trees close around it. Visibility drops. The Mavic 800 meters away can no longer see the strike drone directly, but it can see the Pantsir, and that is what matters now. The crew of the Pantsir-S1 has 30 seconds left to live their old lives. They do not know it. The radar in the cabin is still in standby. The man walking the perimeter is looking at his phone. The lieutenant colonel is still on his call. Somewhere above them, 4 meters off the forest floor, a $500 quadcopter is closing on the rear of the launcher at a relative speed of 55 kilometers per hour. This is the moment we opened with. We are about to see why it ended the way it did. At range 400 meters, the strike drone pops up briefly to 2 meters above the canopy, requires line of sight on the Pantsir's launcher rails, and confirms aim point. The Mavic, watching from 800 meters slant, captures the entire sequence in 4K. The footage the brigade later released begins here. At range 200 meters, the operator commits. There is a moment in the recording where the camera bobble settles, the trees blur, and the silhouette of the Pantsir's missile canister fills the lower third of the frame. The radar dome, the panel the Russian crew has been trusting to keep them alive, is rotating slowly to the right, scanning a sector that does not contain the drone. At range 80 meters, the strike drone passes between 2 birch trunks with what Ukrainian operators in post-mission debrief described as roughly 1 meter of clearance on each side. The wind has dropped briefly to almost nothing. The operator has stopped breathing. At range 20 meters, the Russian crewman walking the perimeter looks up. He has half a second. The first impact lands on the rearmost missile canister of the upper launcher rail. The contact fuse functions exactly as designed. 800 grams of high explosive enters a sealed steel tube containing a solid propellant rocket motor and a fragmentation warhead. The result, captured in slow motion by the Mavic overhead, is a sustained white-orange bloom that lasts approximately 4 seconds and consumes the entire upper portion of the launcher. The sympathetic detonation comes 9 seconds later. The remaining missiles on the launcher rail, Ukrainian analysts assess between 6 and 10 still loaded, cook off in sequence, each adding its propellant and warhead to a growing column of fire. The radar dome, mounted directly above the launcher, takes the brunt of the second wave. The dome tilts, melts, and collapses into the burning cabin. The Kamaz chassis splits along the center line. Solid propellant continues to vent into the tree line for the next 40 minutes, igniting the underbrush and forcing nearby Russian troops to evacuate the bivouac. The Mavic holding station records the entire sequence. The footage will be in the operating brigade's release within 72 hours, geolocated by OSINT analysts within 90 minutes of that release. Inside the basement command post 40 kilometers away, the Ukrainian operator finally exhales. He sets the controller down. He says on the recording the brigade did not release a single word that the editing team replaced with a beep. His co-pilot puts a hand on his shoulder. The third officer is already writing the after-action. Outside the Pantsir's burning chassis, the Russian crewman who had half a second is no longer accounted for. The 2 crewmen inside the cabin did not get out. The lieutenant colonel in his command tent 200 meters away ran toward the wreckage and then ran back. There was nothing to do. The system burned for the rest of the afternoon. The intercepted radio chatter, surfaced by Ukrainian signals collection assets and circulated on Russian milblogger channels within hours, captured what came next. The The lieutenant colonel called the regional air defense coordinator and reported a Pantsir destroyed by FPV strike. 3 crew lost, system unrecoverable. The coordinator's reply, as later transcribed by OSINT analysts on Telegram, was a single sentence asking whether the radar had been active at the time of engagement. The lieutenant colonel said it had not. There was a pause on the line that the transcribers noted ran to nearly 11 seconds. Then the call ended. The regional headquarters declared a force protection alert across the sector. 2 other Pantsir batteries in the area were ordered to displace immediately. One of them, according to subsequent geolocated footage, displaced into another tree line approximately 6 kilometers north and was struck by a different Ukrainian FPV unit 3 days later. That is a different video. The Mavic that recorded the strike held station for another 6 minutes, capturing the secondary cook-offs, the evacuation of the nearby bivouac, and the arrival of a Russian fire response team that took one look at the cooking propellant and reversed their vehicles back down the access track. Then the Mavic turned south, descended to low altitude, and crossed back into Ukrainian-controlled airspace 22 minutes later. A flagship Russian air defense platform, designed and built specifically to defeat low-altitude drones, had been defeated by a low-altitude drone. The system that was supposed to be the answer became the question. That question, what is a Pantsir actually for, if it cannot defend itself from a $500 quadcopter? Is the one Russian air defense planners have been refusing to answer in public for 9 months. The footage from Kursk makes the refusal harder. The accounting, $15 million of platform, according to Russian procurement figures Western analysts use as the standard reference. 12 surface-to-air missiles loaded on the rails, at roughly $500,000 per round in the export configuration and somewhat less in the domestic configuration. Call the missile load alone $6 million on the low side. A Kamaz 6560 chassis at around $200,000. A phased array radar at a figure the Russian Ministry of Defense has classified, but which Western analysts assess at $3 to $4 million. Crew of 3, all contractniki, all having signed contracts in the post-mobilization wave for the standard signing bonuses in the range of $15,000 to $25,000, and the salary multiples that make Russia's Ukraine theater an economic proposition for the men who choose it. Against that, a quadcopter airframe built in a workshop the brigade has not disclosed, 800 grams of recovered explosive, a contact fuse, a battery, a camera, and a transmitter. $500 at the upper bound. The cost ratio is 1 to 30,000 if you count only the platform. If you count the missile load and the radar, it climbs past 1 to 50,000. According to OSINT analysts cross-referencing geolocated footage with known Russian air defense deployments, this is the 3rd Pantsir-S1 confirmed destroyed on the Kursk axis since March. The 2 prior losses occurred in similar configurations. Static deployments protecting logistics nodes, radar in standby, no overhead drone screen, no perimeter electronic warfare bubble dense enough to defeat a low-altitude FPV. The pattern is now sufficiently established that Russian millbloggers, the ones who still risk public commentary, have begun calling for doctrinal changes that the Russian Ministry of Defense has so far declined to issue. The intercepted chatter from the hours after the strike included a request from the regional headquarters for additional Pantsir batteries to be moved into the sector to replace the loss. The response from the Central Air Defense Coordinating Staff, surfaced on Russian millblogger channels, was that no replacement batteries were available in the near term. The Kursk axis is now defended by fewer Pantsirs than it was 24 hours before the strike. And the replacement pipeline is, by Russia's own admission on its own networks, empty. The corridor south of the logistics hub, which the Pantsir had been deployed to protect, was used by a Ukrainian deep-strike fixed-wing drone 2 nights after the strike. That drone reached a fuel depot 18 kilometers further north and ignited a diesel stockpile that burned for 9 hours. The depot's fire crew, according to geolocated footage, included men who had been part of the Pantsir bivouac evacuation 48 hours earlier. Remember the lieutenant colonel who chose coverage over survivability. His coverage gap killed another fuel depot before he had finished writing the incident report on his Pantsir. The lesson for Russian air defense crews is that the Pantsir-S1 cannot defend itself from the threat it was designed to defeat. That is not a technological claim. The radar exists, the cannons exist, the missiles exist. It is a doctrinal claim. The system requires displacement, perimeter EW, overhead drone screening, and active tracking to function as advertised. Russian commanders, under pressure from a frontline that demands constant coverage, have been issuing the system without those layers. The result is a $500 quadcopter walking past $15 million of hardware and reducing it to vented propellant. The lesson for Ukrainian operators is that the asymmetry holds and the asymmetry compounds. Every Pantsir lost is a missile battery. The Russian Federation cannot replace at the speed Ukrainian FPV cells can iterate. Every iteration of the FPV airframe is cheaper than the iteration before, and every replacement Pantsir is more expensive than the one before. That is not a war Russia wins by attrition. That is a war Russia loses by arithmetic. The Ukrainian cell that ran this engagement is still operational. The reconnaissance Mavic has been replaced. The strike platform was, by definition, expended. The two operators and the third officer are, according to the brigade's release, already working the next targets. The Pantsir batteries that displaced after the strike are now somewhere in the Kursk tree line, and the Mavics are looking. The forest is not safe. The logistics hubs it shields are not safe. The lieutenant colonel who chose coverage over survivability discovered in a single afternoon that the choice was never his to make. The choice belongs to the cell with the cheaper drone and the longer patience. On this day in this tree line, the choice was Ukrainian. Another invader's flagship system burned ingloriously in soil that was Russian by maps and Ukrainian by trajectory. The defenders moved the line another 5 kilometers further from the front. The line will keep moving.